Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. If you're like me, you've been scouring the internet looking for videos that explain to you the lore and history of the Drow of Eberron. You've been really disappointed to find out there really isn't a lot. So that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to explain to you the lore of Eberron. I hope you like it. The first thing I want to go over before we talk about the Drow of Eberron is whenever you're making characters or encounters or world building with Eberron, you need to know that Keith Baker wrote this campaign setting to be very different from the rest of the other campaign settings. It's far different from Greyhawk or the Sword Coast because some of the races that you would know are evil aren't evil, and pretty much the entire pantheon that you're used to playing with is not in the book. And one of the key factors of the Drow actually is there is no Lulth. So when I'm explaining these kind of things and tidbits to you in this video, I just want you to keep that in the back of your mind, that Lulth is not part of the Pantheon, and there are other deities that are also not part of the Pantheon either, and there are going to be deities we're going to talk about today that you've never heard of, and that's okay. Enable for you to understand the history of the Drow, you first need to understand the history of the Giants. You see, the Giants are a organized group that existed on the continent of Zendrik, and about 80,000 years ago during the Age of Giants, by some means they enslaved the Elves. Some people say that they did this by going to the Feywild and just taking the Elves. Some people say that the Elves were just given to them as a gift from a higher power. The nice thing about Keith Baker is he writes it very open-ended for you to interpret, so if you want to have your own interpretation on how the Elves were enslaved, then go for it. Run that, because honestly, if you're going to look for an exact answer in Eberron, you're probably not going to find a solid answer, especially when we're talking about things like the Age of Giants or the Age of Monsters. There are some facts that we know are true, but some names in history and timelines are kind of left out or written to be rumors. Again, that's just how Keith Baker wrote the campaign. He wants it to be very sandboxy, he wants it to be very open-ended. So when you're going to talk about how the Giants enslaved the Drow, enslaved the Elves even, you're going to need to just take everything that everybody has said about them with just a grain of salt, because, like I just said, it's left very open-ended, and that's on purpose. At some point during the Age of Giants, the dragons of Argonison decided to take an interest in them and teach them the ways of the arcane magic. They came down to Zendrik and they taught the Giants everything they needed to know about magic, how to make magical items, how to make flying cities, how to make magical barriers and rituals, and even create their own curses and stuff like that. And it was really important to the Giants' history that they did this, because as they did it, they learned two things. The first thing that they learned is that the Elves were very keen to learning this magic. They picked it up a lot faster than the Giants ever could, and that kind of posed a bit of a threat. And it's because of this that I believe they got a little bit more, I want to say a little bit more abusive towards the Elves. This is the part where the slavery really started. Like beforehand, you could see kind of a mutual agreement. Like sure, they were still captured slaves, but now it's getting to the point where Giants are just taking out their aggressions on them, and they're really just being abusive and mean towards the Elves, because they are afraid that the Elves are going to learn how to master magic. Now, when we say things like master magic, during the Age of Giants, the second thing they learned from the Giants, or from the dragons, that are really important, is they learned this technique called shadow breeding. And shadow breeding allows you to take a specific animal and breed it 100 times using magic until you get a peak perfect animal. You'll actually see this in the Elven House of House Thorani. They'll do this with their horses. But the Giants did this to the Elves until they made the Drow Elves. That's correct. The Giants actually made the Drow Elves using the shadow breeding technique. The Giants created the Drow Elves for the sole purpose of having a arcane assistant. They didn't really treat the Drow Elves as slaves. They created them as pets. They pampered them. They kept them in their homes and their castles. They were part of their military. They were welcome inside of the Giants' churches to open worship. Many Drow Elves of Zendrik still live with Giants because they're just so welcome in that community. But I think it's because of this change towards the Drow, like how they treated the Drow. I think this is where the hate for Drow became more prevalent in the Elven community, because the Elves were still enslaved at this point, and it kind of felt like to the Elves it was really pointless for them to be there if they created these other more perfect Drow to do their bidding, and then just kind of like left the smaller Drow to do basically all the dirty work. And I think this is where the hate for all of the Drow come into play. I can't, there's really no proof of that, but I think, to me at least, when I'm reading the history, this is what kind of pick up on, that the Drow being pampered and being part of the slavers and being part of that enforcement has really created there's just this hate and disgust for Drow. And Elves in Eberron are very ancestral. They care a lot about the ancestors. The House of the Undeath wants to focus on keeping their history known, no matter how long it is, no matter how gross or wrong or dirty it is. They want to keep that history known throughout the Elven community. And I think that if you dig deep enough in the Library of Eärendil, you will find records of the Drow and the enslavement of the Elves. As the Age of Giants continue to grow, so does their greed and power. They become very malicious towards other races, and they start having a bunch of infighting and creating very powerful magical items that are causing a lot of damage to Zendrik. The dragons, who are still alive at this point, who originally taught the giants how to use their magic, started to notice this and started to be a little bit more forceful with their rules of magic. They started to get into fights, and eventually a full-blown war broke out during the events of a Delkir invasion. Now, if you don't know who the Delkir are, that's okay. That's like a whole nother video. I don't want to waste 20 minutes explaining it during the Drow, but just know they're a demonic force, and they were very bad. When the Delkir were invading and some of the giants were busy fighting dragons, the elves decided to go, hey, you know what? We're also rebelling. And they started to rebel. They started killing giants left, right, and center. They started burning down civilizations. They started making it weaker. And as their civilizations started to fall, the Delkir gained more ground in Zendrik. The dragons took notice of this as well, and so did the elves, because they were a demonic force, and there was kind of a large separation of the Drow elves who tried to fight the Delkir, finding themselves to either be part of the rebellion or dying in protection of the giants. Now, when we talk about what happens next, it's very important to point out that in Eberron there was a great calamity. There was a huge explosion during the Great War that, really destroyed a big part of the continent, and everything died. Funnily enough, during the Age of Giants, the Giants actually cause a calamity. They build a magical machine capable of wiping out Zendrik in hopes to kill the Delkir. The dragons try and stop it. Whether or not they did stop it or it actually went off, nobody knows, because Keith Baker wrote it that way. But the Giants created a massive death magic that destroyed a lot of Zendrik. It even was the result of destroying of the moon, Sira. Sira, the 13th moon, remember, was actually destroyed because of this event. So they destroyed the moon, and they attempted to kill the Delkir. It wasn't really known whether or not they destroyed Zendrik, but they did that, and by doing so, they wiped their whole kingdom off the map. This was the end of the Giants. But the Drow elves, who were still alive, lived on Zendrik and stayed there, while the rest of the elves, they left for Eärendil or the sea or things like that. But the Drow elves stayed, and 80,000 years passed, and now we're going to have the factions of Drow that we're going to talk about in the next part of this video. In Eberron, there are 3 main factions of Drow that are written in the book. Please know you can have more than these 3 factions if your campaign sees it fit, but these are the 3 main factions of Eberron that are written by Keith Baker, and they are present in the book as the character options. They're also the 3 factions of Drow that split off during the destruction of the Giant Empire. These 3 factions are the valkorum, the Sulatar Drow, and the umbragon. I don't know why they call themselves the umbragon, but they do. I'm going to get into why they do that here in a minute. I just want to cover that right now. I know a lot of people are going to put that in the comments, but we're going to go over why people refer to them as the umbragon here in a minute. The first faction of Drow that we're going to talk about are the valkorum. They are a faction of Drow that worship the scorpion god Valkor. Valkor is a half-man, half-scorpion. Usually has the upper body of a Drow elf and the lower body of a scorpion with 2 pincers and a long tail at the end. He creates smaller versions of himself called the Skaro. The Skaro, again, same thing, look like scorpions at the bottom, Drow elves on top. Because of these creations, the Drow started worshipping him. Valkor is the master of the hunt. He likes hunting, he likes, tracking things down, finding lost treasures, things like that. So when the valkorum started worshipping the Valkor, they focused a lot more on the hunting aspect, a lot more of the druidic magic, a lot more of the shape changing, the rituals of the moon, stuff like that. So that unlike the other factions of Drow, they've completely gone the opposite direction in regards to technology and have decided to stay a little disassociated with the rest of society. They make great guides for Zendrik. If you're traveling in Zendrik and you can find a group of valkorum, they're great for guiding because they know the island like the back of their hand. They're great at hunting. And honestly, if you're looking for a nice kind of mid-level challenge, the valkorum can also pose a threat, but they're very neutral. They will not go out of the way to help anybody, and they will not go out of the way to kill anybody for any reason, unless, they have a reason. So, if you're going to use these guys, use that wisely. Another thing that you should probably know is the Skaro, which are the half drow, half scorpions, are very potent hunters. They are very stealthy, very skilled and keen at killing prey as fast as possible. As a matter of fact, they produce this type of poison that is extremely deadly to giants. It is rumored that one sting from one of these creatures can take out that of a storm giant. So you should, if you're going to run these in a DM campaign or learn about them, you should know about that. And another thing you should probably know about is the male drow elves of the tribe valkorum. To them, being turned into a Skaro when they die or at some point in their life is considered a great honor. Unlike in the Sword Coast, when we talk about Triders and how they're usually considered freaks of nature, they're not welcome inside the tribes, you will see groups of Skaro work with valkorum. As far as like matron mothers go, usually when I run them, I kind of turn them into like druids, like arc druids, because again, they're more focused on the druidic nature of life, about, the nature, the hunting, the survival aspects, more so than the arcane styles of magic. So, if you want to run that too, that is. I just want to throw those things in there for you. But lastly, we're going to talk about something that I think is really cool about the valkorum, and what sets them off from the rest of the tribes of drow is they like to inject their skin with the poison of other scorpions, which kind of leaves a nice like white mark. So they kind of tattoo themselves using poison, kind of like a pithing needle, and they just go in there and they start creating tattoos. This creates a lot of unique philosophy and kind of like a little bit show of their history, because they are very ancestral oriented. They do care a lot about their ancestors. As a matter of fact, I think the reason why they really like the Skaro is because this specific group of drow were taking part in the rebellion against the giants, and I feel as if maybe they were fighting giants and one of the Skaros came along and started killing giants, and they were like, well, he looks like us and he's killing giants, so he must be sent by some higher deity. And the last thing I want to point out, which is really important, the Skaro aren't actually demons, they're aberrations. That's important to keep in mind here as we're talking about the Drow, because you'll see a lot of ties in with aberrations and a lot more of that type of creature than celestials and demons. And we're going to talk about that here when we talk about the final tribe of Drow, but I just need you to keep that in mind. The second faction of Drow are the Sulatar. The Sulatar Drow are very martial oriented. They're very much into hand-to-hand combat and fighting and things like that. These Drow, for me anyway, they've always been the pushing force, like an evil force in your campaign. Not saying that they're all evil, but they definitely feel like they kind of have a little bit of the old traditions of the giants. We study magic for the purpose of arcane binding, to create magical items, to create weapons, to then push our power even further. And it's very easy as a DM to take that and run that as a villain. Another thing that's good to point out is they're really good at elemental binding. Elemental binding is a process in which you take a fire elemental and bind it into a controlled soul gem. That's putting it lightly, but that's how it works. This is actually used in Zalargo for making airships, and it was used by the giants first when creating certain weapons and other things. So the Sulatar have taken that tradition and used it for themselves. That means you might actually find more magical items with these Drow elves than you would normally find with other Drows. It is very reasonable that you might come into a band of Sulatar that are hunting, or a bunch of Sulatar mercenaries, and they all have flame tongues. Like, they all have this magical item, the flame tongue, and they're just running around with it. And it's completely reasonable. And it's one of the reasons why I use my Dragon Force in Eberron, because when you have a bunch of people using magical items doing things like this, it creates kind of a conflict for your players. They also have these awesome, cool items that I learned from Shards of Eberron. It's a YouTube channel here on YouTube, obviously, and they do D&D podcasts in Eberron called the Kyber Shards. and they kind of introduced this idea called the fire skiffs. Now, I don't actually know if this is official lore or not, but I kind of feel like it is. Fire skiffs are kind of like miniature 2 to 3 person airships that they fly around in the sky, and it makes a lot of sense because they're do the elemental binding. So when they're flying around and doing that and having like a fire, like an airship made of fire, it's kind of awesome, and I really like it. So I just want to point that out. Another thing is they're clerics, forged clerics, like hands down. Okay, they are 100% forged clerics. Like, dwarves are usually forged clerics, but these drow focus on crafting for sure. Now, Sulatar and fire giants, they get along. Okay, they work with fire giants a lot. They work with other giants too, mostly fire. And because they work with fire giants, they're not really at good terms with the valkorum, who hate giants. So there's kind of a, I wouldn't say a war, but there's a conflict. They definitely don't like each other because they worship the Skoro, and the Skoro kill the fire giants, and the fire giants don't want to die. And they need the fire giants. So, you know, there's going to be a little bit of conflict. Again, there's not a war there, but there is some conflict. The Sulatar are also capable of working with society. I want to point that out. If you're looking to play a Drow character, the Sulatar are very knowledgeable in negotiation and, again, magical items. They fit right into any D&D Eberron campaign that you can think of because they already know about artificers. They already know about Warforged. They already know about elemental binding. Seriously. They know what they're doing with magic, and they fit into Eberron so much better than the other 2 factions. If you're playing an Eberron character, play Sulatar. You don't have to be an artificer. You don't have to be a wizard. You don't have to be a forged cleric. You can be a fighter, and you just have knowledge of magical items. Super cool. All right? Super cool. The last faction Drow we're going to talk about in this video is the umbragon. The umbragon are a faction of Drow that used to be referred to as the Quabarian Elves. The Quabarian Elves had a civilization that they ruled, which is now referred to as the Ring of Storms. If you were to look on a map today, that's where their kingdom would be. It was destroyed by a giant chunk of Siberia's crystal that fell from the sky, and because of that, they were pushed underground, and eventually, over the 80,000 years after the giants, they found themselves in Khyber, where they live. They made a pact with a dark force called Umbra. Now, Umbra isn't really referred to a lot in the books. It could be a dark deity, it could be an eldritch knight, it could be anything like that. We don't know what it is, but we know that they made a pact with Umbra. They are currently at war with the Delkir, and they're also at war with Belishiria and her army of, you know, mind flayers, beholders, aberrations, things like this. They are probably the only faction in Eberron that speaks Undercommon, as it is the only faction of Drow that have been isolated away from the other Drow elves. So if you are going to introduce Undercommon, they are, in writing, the only people in Eberron that actually speaks Undercommon. So that's kind of impressive. One of the things I also want to point out too that isn't in a book but is on Keith Baker's blog has stated that if a Quabarian elf, aka an umbragon elf, were to come to the surface world and go to Corvair, they would think of Sharn, the City of Towers, as a dirty backwater. They wouldn't care for it. And that's really impressive to think about. This kind of gives me some nice, like, Wakandan vibes. Like, maybe if you wanted to play Umbra again as, like, Wakanda, where it's super tech and, like, very advanced, you could run it. Because if they're thinking Sharn, the City of Towers, is a backwater, you gotta kind of imagine what they got going on in Khyber. Because Sharn's kind of impressive. You can run a whole campaign from 1 to 20 there. So if they don't really think Sharn is impressive, man, you gotta think about what they got going on. Now, at the start of the video, when we talked about the valkorum, I told you to keep in mind about the fact that the Skoro and valkorum were aberrations. They were not demons, they were not celestials, they weren't monstrosities or anything like that. They were aberrations. It's important to point that out because Umbra, the deity that the umbragon have ties with, is actually the deity of aberrations, which I think is very interesting. And I know that this, at this point, this is just a theory and there's no actual proof, but it's a pretty big coincidence that Umbra is the deity of aberrations and valkorum and the Skoro are aberrations. Just saying. That feels a little bit too on the nose for us as players and as a DM to not look at that and go, well, maybe in some weird way Umbra is looking after the valkorum, and maybe that was the deal they made with the umbragon. Maybe the umbragons separated themselves here and said, we'll stay here and fight your war, but ensure that our brethren's up top are free from the giants, or something like that. You know what I mean? Because again, it's too on the nose to sit here and say the Umbra, the god of aberrations, and the Scarro aberrations, and Valkor is an aberration himself. Well, I shouldn't say he's an aberration himself. I'm sorry. To say Valkor is an aberration would be a little unfair on him. But he's not like a deity that talks to the Drow, the Valkorum. Valkor doesn't talk to them. So how do we know that the Valkor is actually not just Umbra? That's crazy. I'm going to stop talking about my tinfoil hat theory here, but man, seriously. It's too much of a coincidence, right? Thank you so much for watching. That concludes the video, but I'm not done. I actually have some custom backgrounds and stat blocks for these Drow factions in the comments below for D&D Beyond, and you can just take the photos of the stat blocks that I've made in the homebrew section and save them for anything else if you don't want to use them in D&D Beyond. As for the rest of the video, let me know what you guys thought. This is my first long video. I'm usually just on TikTok or Twitch, so I don't usually do this type of stuff, but I've decided to move over to YouTube to kind of just do something else a little bit different for 2023. Again, please let me know what you think. I'm going to hopefully have a bi-weekly schedule of more stuff like this. So yeah, thank you so much for watching, and good luck.